He's the founder of Design Studio for Social Intervention, and I think they are one of the most amazing spaces and change maker places in Boston that brings together art, academia, artists, and kind of thinking about co-creation, collaboration with professionals, with community members, and also having impact on the public sphere and public side. So they do a lot of many different, they wear a lot of different hats. And also I'm really interested in how they actually keep the design center this sustained organism, that it's moving and it's doing multiple iterations in different cities actually. I'm going to read just a little blurb. I'll let Kenny do the full introduction himself. Just to give you an idea, so in practice, the Design Studio for Social Intervention works in the public sphere. The studio is a space where activists, artists, academics, and larger public come together to imagine new approaches to social change and new angles to address complex social issues. We also design social intervention that engage populations in imagining and designing new solutions to social problems. It started in 2016. Actually, Kenneth was here at Center for Reflective Community Practice, working with you founded, yes, you founded the lab with Caesar, and then
Caesar McDowell.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's at MIT.
Yes. So Kenneth was actually at MIT before.
Yeah, we started the studio here. We started the studio at Caesar's outfit when he was running it. Now it's Collab.
And then he could give us more about the history of it. And the other amazing element about that is that thinking about how thinking really interdisciplinary, and you guys bring many different approaches together and artists to work on these issues. So I'm going to just pass on the table to Kenneth, because I'm sure he's going to do it much better. I got to know the Design Studio through the time that I was an artist in residence with the city of Boston, and Design Studio for Social Intervention were partners with the city, kind of helping all the artists to design and to iterate their projects. So that's how I got to really closely get to work with you guys and to know the studio.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Kenny again. Hi, everybody. And before I jump into what we're thinking about now, let me make that go back up. How do I make that go back up? Oh, I think you have to put your password back in. You can. I'm just going to say I'm really happy to be here because a big chunk of our mission is trying to bring into the same sphere and into the same conversations artists, activists, and academics. What we find is that we all have different slices of the truth and different discourses that help us sort of understand what the social is and how it operates, and therefore how to affect it or change it. But those discourses don't often get to commingle in concrete ways that actually can shift how we practice. And so a big chunk of our work has been about trying to figure that out. And it's difficult. Artists have a way of understanding the world that's very different than activists. And the ways our bodies are structured and our senses of time and place are different, as with academics. Coordinating those spheres is quite difficult, but one of our premises has been where and when we can bring those spheres together and create the conditions of trust and communication across those spheres, we can stumble onto interesting, novel insights into what the social is and how to solve with it or how to address it. We often think we understand what the social is. We often think we know what it is from our vantage point or our sphere of encounter with it. And one of the things we find is when trust is structured and people can learn from each other their sense of what the social is and how it's structured, we can actually find new levers into it and therefore affect it in ways that might be more robust than we would have if we just stuck to our own understandings. And the last thing I'll say too is that those understandings of the social tend to stay embedded within particular regimes of practice. So the way academics understand the social, unless you traverse that world, tend to stay regulated to that world. And I would say the same thing is true of artists and contemporary artists. You know, the kinds of conversations that they're having about what the social is and how to affect it tend to stay sort of in the sphere of the gallery and in the sphere of art discourse. And I would say the same is true of us, of people who consider themselves social change practitioners. We stay in our own worlds. So we try to use this method of design and this as an excuse to create an opportunity for those ways of knowing to encounter each other. And instead of talking a lot about that, I think what I wanted to do is make an invitation and jump right into some of the things that we're thinking about in real time at the studio. And after sort of going over some of the stuff we're thinking about in real time, to make a proposal, an invitation, and to an opportunity for us to speculate on how to continue to bring artists, academics, and activists together to figure out the conundrums we find ourselves in now. So I'm going to lay out a conundrum we're struggling with, and invite you all to struggle with us with it. So the name of this talk is New Strategies for New Atmospheres, a call to reimagine public life. So about maybe, is it 4 years now? When we saw the emergence of state-sanctioned violence and it really became sort of part of political lives before, right before we saw the birth of Black Lives Matter, we at the studios could see that we were about to take a really crazy turn in our cultural zeitgeist. And we called that turn a social emergency. And we started using this term social emergency to really get at what we could see starting to happen was a breakdown in social fabric and a breakdown in relationality and a lack of tools with which to recognize that breakdown or to address it. And one of the things we talked about with this idea of social emergency is we could see forms of distrust happening at the horizontal plane. So you get on, you would talk to people who would get on a train or a bus or any sort of public interaction and wonder if they were sitting next to somebody who supported the cops, or if they were sitting next to somebody who might let them be killed. And these forms of affect we saw as a problem that would continue to grow. And it did. We went from state-sanctioned violence to Keystone Pipeline to stuff with immigration to stuff with gender. And what we saw was an amplification of breakdown in social fabric. And we would say that it didn't start with Trump, but a different thing happened, a different thing got crystallized the day we saw him in that sort of scene on the front of the screen when he won. That it is sort of, if all of these things were episodes, that was a new crystallization of a new kind of what we think about as atmosphere. I read this essay a long time ago by this guy Sloterdijk, Atmosphere is Politics, and it made me start thinking a lot about that atmospheres matter and that we produce them between each other, and that we have to attend to an atmosphere that actually mimics the kind of sociality we're interested in. Otherwise, it can shift. And those are the kinds of ways we get to think about problems inside the studio, and we get to propose those kinds of problems to people who are thinking about social justice in concrete ways, organizing around policy, to people who are thinking about sculpture, or folk who are thinking about VR and AI. And so we get to invite people into these new ways of thinking about problems and to play with us around these new ways of thinking about problems. So this is a new, this setting atmosphere as a problem is a set that we at the studio feel is important to propose to people and to have people think with us about. And so after we declared we were in a social emergency, one of the things we created was this thing called social emergency response centers. And those gave people an opportunity to come together, deal with the shift, feel how they were feeling, and figure out how to act in this climate. But one of the things we've noticed is our ability to act horizontally has been trumped by the infrastructure's capacity to act vertically. So if for us, people might take 6 or 7 months to pull off a social emergency response center, and before they pulled it off, we've had 30 more catastrophes. We've been inundated with catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe, which affects us and has its own sort of ways that it sort of continues to break down social fabric. And one of the ways we're talking about this particular atmosphere we're facing right now is white aggression. And I'm just going to show some scenes to sort of have us recall some of the episodes we've dealt with in the United States around this atmosphere. We are living amidst an atmosphere of constant aggression, attack, and repression. And for most of us, that's just the backdrop. We don't get to actually step back and say, we are in this thing. And it's affecting us, and how do we affect it? So, another sort of conundrum we find ourselves faced with is, instead of response to the atmosphere, what we find ourselves having the opportunity to do is to go to the mall, is to sort of just stay in humdrum time and stay in sort of our silos and in everyday life, that there's nothing to see here. Similar to this idea, it's the point makes itself. You can't outmake this point. that while we're in this sort of atmosphere of aggression, what we have is go to the mall. So one of the questions we're posing to people who care about our social fabric is what's our go to the mall? Like how are we right now in our sort of public lives sort of putting our heads in the sand and allowing the atmosphere that has been established to continue? What are we doing? How are we in some ways sort of implicated in the current political atmosphere we find ourselves in? And how is this nothing to see here instantiated in space? We're really interested in, for most people, the go to the mall is when you leave your house and you go outside, there isn't a set of containers with which to step into that acknowledge the direness of the situation we find ourselves dealing with as a society. And so we pose this question: what does it mean to design counter atmospheres? And one of the things we're really interested in is figuring out how to create opportunities, conditions, spaces of encounter that normal people who might be skateboarding down the street, who might, be on their way to buy groceries, could encounter this other thing that might bring delight or might actually start to model the world we want versus the world that is being broadcast out through the atmosphere of white aggression. So we know what these atmospheres are. We have, examples. Gay pride is an example of creating a counter atmosphere. Here is in Oakland, every Sunday, people get together and play drums, and folk get together and dance in a public square. The taco truck at every mosque, which was an intervention in response to DACA and sort of, taking away of immigrant rights. It was immigrant to immigrant solidarity. And this is an example from the Prague quadrennial of artists making costumes and trying to figure out how to get around when they couldn't actually see and how to interact with people. So we know how to start to we have techniques for how to create counter atmospheres. Some of our questions are, here's another one, Ovarian Cycles. It's a Latina-led version of Critical Mass that's just women-led. Another example from Prague quadrennial was making parades at night with, techniques of light and thin paper. And we know how to create mood. Here's another example from India, just performing in the streets and telling stories. It was a version of, God, what do you call this? Like Theater of the Oppressed. This was another project we did at the studio called Hair Greasing that was connected to sort of responding to state-sanctioned violence by just getting black folk together and doing something that we normally think of as intimate and happens inside. We brought it outside and did it as an action, as a gesture. So we have some of these ideas. We have some of these tools. I guess for us, our question is, how do we take these small tools and techniques, better understand them and amplify them in a way that they become a larger part of everyday life? How do we make a case to people that this is work? How do we make a case to people that this work is necessary as the work of sort of the behind the scenes organizing that we think of as the stuff that's important? So I guess another sort of way into this is right now everybody's really excited about the people who've been elected that are now, kicking butt inside of Congress. And that is a piece of work. it is not the only work we need to be doing, because there's all of this leftover stuff between us that's out here in public that we need to be addressing as well. And that work isn't as codified or recognized or as seen as important. Well, I don't want to say it's seen as important. It's just not. It's work that hasn't been codified as work yet. It still needs to be imagined. It still needs to be designed. It still needs to be lifted up. This is another example from the big urban game movement. This happened actually in St. Paul and Minneapolis, where they blew up a version of, I want to say, it was like a very simple board game, but they made it the size of 2 cities. And what's
Parcheesi?
No, that's not Parcheesi. It's a very simple, like Life or something, or
Sorry.
It's Sorry. They blew up Sorry and played Sorry across 2 cities. And another example. This happened after, I forgot when Subway Therapy happened, but it was in response to a situation that New York was dealing with, or we all were dealing with, and some artists got together and just created an opportunity for people to just write down how they were feeling and to put it up in public space so people could come and read and participate. It's just another, we love it as another sort of amazing, just clean, easy technique. Caribbean Carnival. We know how to create atmosphere. So I guess now I want to open it up to us. With the sets of tools and the sets of techniques we have here, and the set of relationships we have here, you can just turn to somebody or turn and make with 3 people. How might we contribute to creating counter atmospheres? What kind of things would we want to put out in public? What sorts of tools or techniques do we have at our disposal in our networks that we think we could bring out to bear to add to this bailiwick of creating counter atmospheres? Just turn to 1 or 2 people and just have a quick conversation about that. All right. Let's hear some thoughts. Let's hear some thoughts.
I had a very easy thought, and it was the first that came out, so it's really not complex, but when I'm hearing us talk about the same different aspects of it, is whether it's specific actions, whether it's looking gaining outside views looking in, not just having your own perspective on things, but even from, how is the political situation here seen by outside countries or different situations. And I was even mentioning daily life. I think it's about decolonizing imagination. So we mentioned really just like thinking atmospheres are created, but one way of disrupting these atmospheres are making sure that we decolonize the way we imagine, the way we're put in a situation and whose situation we're supposed to be in or surrounded by. Just breaking a little bit of these boxes that we're all put in.
Thank you. Keep going.
We started with a question more than the answer, because the thought was that a lot of the negative atmospheres, they usually have what do you call it, like collateral damages. Like they usually have consequences that it lasts beyond that event or that atmosphere that exists.
They accumulate.
Yes. But how is it that the positive ones, they are not as much building up into something? And it feels like, I like how Andrew responded to this, that like it's like physics, like it's like almost physics, how you build a structure and then just to destroy it, you just like pull something and the whole thing falls, rather than when you want to build it. And how we can like think about, like, maybe coming back at what you guys are saying, of like a different way of thinking or designing, that it could actually have an accumulation event, rather than, okay, there is an event and people go spread out and everybody's like individual again. how could these accumulate into a building structure rather than, because the negative forces always do that, always like take away. Anything that Trump is taking away with the policy, like it's gonna have years of consequences until we can like get it back. Or yeah, so that's sort of like rethinking of like what we think about design and how we can rethink about.
I really like the idea of accumulation, and it actually makes me rethink the two examples that I used in our group. And so one of them was Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Boston, and like calling sort of the encampment that was created right across from South Station, which persisted for months and had many different, just like an ongoing, evolving scene. But that was an accumulation that reflected a bunch of other movement histories and knowledges about how to organize protest camps. And the other example was a march around the death toll in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and the non-response, negative responses from both the U.S. and the Puerto Rican governments, which drew on Puerto Rican cultural traditions. So there was like a remixed plena song with like small hand drums and a guitar and voice. There was popular theater techniques that had been developed over time by groups like Papel Machete. So there was like a paper mache coffin that represented people who had died that was there, and there was poetry. So basically like drawing on different types of cultural techniques to draw attention to vulture capitalism and neglect of the colonial situation, which is a kind of accumulation of existing techniques and strategies for celebration in public space, but in this case applied to specifically protest outside the front door of this one guy who's a venture capitalist who owns like a quarter of Puerto Rico's debt, who lives in downtown Boston.
Yeah, I was gonna say that guy's here, right?
Yeah.
Another thing to think about are, our institutions that do work. So we have the government institutions that, and a lot of media institutions, whatever, but then there's our public libraries. And what role can they play in sort of allowing people to have more voice and think? And one of the technologies I like, for instance, is projection technology that could be something that could be in libraries that anyone could take out. And so we're kind of rethinking, there's social media where everyone creates videos online, but then offline, what kind of media can you create in your community that brings people together? And projection has a long history of bringing people together and such. And so using our libraries and our community centers and giving them stuff that people can take out, and projection technology being one of them. And then she brought up a good example, which is just Honk is a really nice local initiative.
You all know Honk?
What's it?
Honk street bands,
Is it Honk?
activist street bands from around the world that come here every year.
You mentioned
It's an amazing event that is generative and relates to a lot of
Right.
the issues you were talking about.
And just rethinking what our existing cultural, our institutions here are playing, like having them rethink their role in our communities.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes, it seems like with a lot of these examples, we're talking about things from the activist or artist perspective, but where do the academics come in? That's what I'm trying to understand, because the goal that you mentioned is to bring artists, academics, and activists together. So I think sometimes when it's artists and activists collaborating, they're seen as SJWs or social justice warriors by people who are more academic. So how do we start to get academics or conservatives to take these issues seriously?
Do I repeat?
No, it's okay.
I'm gonna take one more hand, then I'm gonna switch to have you guys play with that question. Take your hand, actually, three more. There's a hand there, a hand there, and a hand right there. Your hand was up.
Yeah. So Melissa raised a really cool point about like the power of bringing a domestic space into the public, and that prompted me to think about how we could maybe create like a house party atmosphere along like a bus line or a transit line where the demographics shift considerably. So like how would you create a sense of home for and by people of like one neighborhood somewhere further down the line in this like shared space? But so we thought food would be important, but I don't know what.
Thank
Do you
you.
know about the Rosa Parks sticker?
Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I was just thinking about the Pink Pussy Hat March and how organically it just came out that all these women natively crocheted or knitted their hats. That's such a female art. And it was a groundswell of support across the nation, and all these women who went to Washington. I mean, they were working around the clock trying to create as many of these hats as possible. And the juxtaposition of a heretofore female-led craft was meaningful because the women came together in knitting and crochet groups, which is so, and that was fueling a positive energy to their anger, creating sisterhood, creating a sense of warmth and a shared cause. And then, of course, going to Washington and having that moment. But then later on, the movement transitioned into a straightforward, if you will, from my point of view, how do we organize, how do we march, how do we keep the momentum going, which is, people got exhausted from that. And it didn't have the shared local response. And so I'm sort of curious about how do you keep because the local is where it's really going to have movement, as opposed to having to travel somewhere and be organized on some, and then it fell into factions. So.
Yeah, and this is why I'm going to piggyback on yours before I come back. This is why we're creating this opportunity for us to actually figure out how do we practice this stuff and to continue to design new forms for taking over the public, because one of the problems we find is that when we stick to classic forms like an annual national march or a march every 6 months or whatever those forms are, if we only use those forms, we don't actually get to accumulate to a point where we can reinvert this physics. So in order for that to happen, we have to think much more expansively, we have to practice much more broadly, and we have to share ideas in much more robust ways in order to get to another kind of scale, in order to imagine other forms of the other forms of creating kind of atmospheres that are sustainable and grounded and local. And so part of what we're doing at the studio is we're testing. We created a dojo to imagine more of these strategies for new atmospheres, to take from these kinds of tools and techniques and to have us continue to expand upon them. I'm going to say more about that later. I'm going to jump back here.
Yeah, I was just kind of off of the young lady's comment. We were talking a little bit about like spaces and sort of what's professional in spaces. So you mentioned about like the academics getting involved, and we were talking about the BSU Black Student Union did a disruption last week here, and then Fran was even saying like going to the opera and wearing like clothes that sort of aren't considered appropriate. So it's sort of like, I think it's easy in like public spaces where you've been saying with gay pride like to be in the streets, but what if it like detoured and came through like the media lab, and so how do you sort of disrupt like what's like the sort of professional or like rules of a space, but then at the same time not have fear of like the sort of I guess consequences of that like afterwards, so that you're truly like creating a different atmosphere that can have long-term impact in a space, but not sort of like negative, I don't know, like side effects, if you will.
There's 4 more hands. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I would comment to that, and also kind of what you were saying about the atmosphere. There was this phenomenon that was happening early last summer. I don't know if anyone remembers it, but there were like these protest parties that started happening. And it started with the woman who like called the cops on those people having a barbecue in Oakland, and then like the next week they like got together and had like a big barbecue with like an electric slide in Oakland. And then there was the guy in New York.
It was literally kind of atmosphere. It was
yeah.
like literally counted to.
Right, and then there was the guy in New York who was like berating these Hispanic like workers, who was an attorney, and so they ended up like throwing a huge fiesta outside of the guy's apartment, and they had like taco trucks and like mariachi bands, and like it was just a way to completely like take the energy of the situation and turn it into something different, while at the same time like leading up to it they would just like meme the person into oblivion for a week. And it was actually pretty amazing to watch. I hope that it would have continued all summer, but if you could get something like that where it was like an event by event basis and really just like turn the negativity into a positive.
Yeah, and I think the point we're trying to make is the events, the way they send energy out, we can address them at an event by event basis, and we have to. But we have to get to a completely different scale in order to address this larger atmosphere that's sort of post-event. So yeah, totally.
I was really thinking about reclaiming public space. I mean, I think this is we're a public organization. Our location and the library are the only places you can come hang out and not have to buy something. You get kicked out of Starbucks. And I think that this idea of reclaiming public space is really important to it's counter-revolutionary actually, or what you're saying, counter atmosphere when you can take back the commons, for example, and put public activities in that space. So, I mean, even just simple things, being at farmers markets or being at places where people are congregating on a Saturday. And then I love the idea of doing theater, and I think that's been so successful in the past to engage people in some kind of, to try to call people into a space that is a public space and a community space. We've been doing something in Holyoke for a couple of years. What's that?
Outside.
Outside, yeah. We've been doing something in Holyoke where it's a bring your own dinner. The community's really divided. It's like, I think it's like 54% Puerto Rican. It's the largest Puerto Rican diaspora outside of Puerto Rico in the whole U.S. per capita in terms of the size. And so it's been really awesome because people who didn't know their neighbors are actually coming into like a space that the city's not developing, and it's sort of a protest against the city also for not developing infrastructure and developing into the community, and taking back that space as a community and getting to know each other and bringing food and sharing food. And it sounds such a simple thing, but it really is, I think, representative of trying to create something that's not the Holyoke Mall, right? That it's like a public space and we can reclaim that. The other thing I was just thinking about is, I think part of breaking down the fear that people feel, I think people feel afraid for good reasons, is to have spaces where we can share vulnerability and build trust. And I'd be curious how people feel like we can do that, because I think that's an important part of the work that we have to do right now in this atmosphere.
Thank you. There was a hand there, then you.
I had a point that was about the partnership with academia, but it kind of diverts from this question of how to build trust in relationships, which I think is really important. But I'll just say really quickly, like, I think the importance of working with academics, and this isn't just within academia, of course, but they offer a way to analyze what is actually happening and create frameworks and just change, like, offer legitimacy in a sense to the work that's being done. Yeah. Which I think is good for when the counter atmosphere has to actually interact with the existing atmosphere. And so how does change actually happen and is able to scale up?
Thank you.
So there's a lot of discussion, certainly here the Open Documentary Lab and, kind of media makers these days and activists around using things like immersive media to kind of supposedly give people access to other spaces. But in a way, I'm thinking about counter atmospheres. One thing that this, to me, still perpetuates often is, who are the people that get to use that kind of immersive, those immersive whatever VR or headsets or whatever, and then they're the ones that are still getting access, right? You get an access to like a refugee camp in Syria or something, right? But so to me, like flipping that, right? So what is the counter to that, right? How you can give people that are often barred, economically or physically or legally from certain public spaces, physical access to those spaces, right? So using almost like the flip side of those tools, right? So, so very briefly, this thing I started mentioning when we were talking here is an initial experiment I did with some people around that was, what if you put some big screens in a public space where a couple people that are barred for various reasons from that space can have a Skype conversation, right? But it's through the space, right? So you have two kind of TVs on the street, right? And the people can see the other screen, and they can also see the passerby and so on, and they can even turn their screen around to look at them and talk to them. But they're not, they're talking with each other and they're experiencing, remotely this place. So they're not. So it's not like they're the ones that are that are manifesting themselves there. So you have to encounter them there. And if you want, you have to ask to talk with them, right? They can just talk with each other too. So so these kind of like flipping this kind of idea of who gets to access whose space, I think, is really an interesting thing to think about.
I'm going to do a plug there too, because the next question after your question is going to be, what are the particular tools and particular academic sort of expertises and techniques that this particular community has that we could bring to bear in terms of creating kind of atmospheres? That's going to be the next question, but after
Well,
you.
thanks for the setup, because what I was going to say, to go back to Samira's point, what the Academy does really well, I think, is pattern recognition, right? We sort of see stuff, and then we can give it name. We can give it a name. I love atmospheres. It's really great for something that we feel, but we don't see. We can't quite put our fingers on it. And I think of people like Guy Debord with the Situationists, or Stephen Duncombe with the idea of the dream. Those are really, they circulate somewhat. But anyway, we're good at pattern recognition. We're pretty good at naming. We've got a built-in network, not only sending students out into the world, that sort of thing, but sending literature, like programs read a lot of the same stuff across the country. So that's a great way for information, for knowledge transfer, for getting concepts that are invisible made visible. And finally, and it goes, we're public spaces mostly. Like we can bring together, like this lab, we can bring a lot of different players to the table, and without a financial stake. It's kind of a flat space, a low stakes space for people to exchange. So that to me is a really, that can trigger a lot of activist work and informant and artistic work and informant. But it's a really, I think it's something we all, at least professional academics, do pretty well and can do a lot better.
So my last question, and you can find somebody else new to talk to, and think of this question as a question/invitation, because I want to follow up with everybody and make sure you all really come and help us out with this. We started this dojo about 2 weeks ago, and we had a bunch of people from the arts, from academia, from civil society sectors come and start trying to imagine new things we could be doing in public to continue to fight this atmosphere. So my question for you all, and now the next piece we're going to have, before I ask the question, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set apart 4 days in June and do a festival for public making, to really start to test in actual space and actual time, how do we continue to grow these techniques for counter atmospheres. And if this is of interest to you, please follow up with us, because one of the things, well, let me step back and ask the next question. So if you were interested in bringing the sets of techniques and tools you have that you could bring to bear from here, from MIT, from this particular set of techniques, come up with one thing you would do at that 4-day festival. One concrete thing, like the Skype idea. What's one thing you think you could pull off at the festival? Find somebody new and talk about it. All right. Let's hear some ideas.
I like the skill share.
I know there wasn't a lot of time. Let's hear some ideas.
So we like the idea of creating the sense of us like being powerful and superheroes in our own right, but then also realizing that we're more powerful together. And so we kind of came up with a few ideas dealing with like different types of like conductivity, whether it's people like, laying down on conductive paint, and if you have enough people laying down together, being able to power some kind of large Tesla coil.
Wow.
Right? That would be so cool. And then we also got to the idea of, I'd seen this kind of like, I don't know if you'd call it an installation or performance, but where these people, they figured out how to make it to where like if they were touching one another, music would play, and if they weren't touching one another, the tone wouldn't, and like based on where they were touching one another, a different tone would play. And so I kind of like started liking the idea of like maybe, you know, a group of people together being a symphony where like, you know, based on how close we are in proximity, like the music playing versus like if you're by yourself, like playing a singular instrument.
I'll just add one thing. I also love the idea of having each individual tone be different, so that it's also a metaphoric way of respecting our differences and our uniqueness that comes together to create a symphony together.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, tiny anecdote to add to what you were saying. Even when it might be useful, what I mean by useful, it's an art form. It's also collective, but it might be useful. I was thinking of a specific example when you were talking in Montreal because it's very cold. There are these bus stands, and the bus stands look a little bit like batteries, but not really. So if you would touch from one end to the other, touching yourselves with a perfect stranger, it would light up and heat up.
Wow.
So you need the others to heat yourself up. So your idea of, you know, more powerful together just made me think, even if the outcome can be fun and mesmerizing, but even sometimes useful, like light up the public space, you know, it might be something that really compels you to do it. You're cold, you have to touch your knee.
Thank you.
So I was too slow because I was going to give the boring one first. But what academics do, again, I said pattern recognition, but this is not the first time this has happened, and it's not the first time people have had creative responses to the kind of crazy atmospheres. And it's sort of like TED Talk style interventions where you try to call those earlier moments and what can we learn from them. We're just mentioning the current moment is really good with terror, right? Mobilizing terror as a way to keep people apart. What happened when the terror of the anarchists ended and the socialists? Like there was hyper terror in this country, and within 6 months it dissipated. Like what was that? How did that happen? Was there a counter discourse? Was there another vision, something else to focus on? Like those moments can become instructional moments and are worth thinking about and worth showing that this moment is unique in all sorts of ways, but it's also related. These are structures that recur, and how can we broker that knowledge from the past rather than just reinventing new futures all the time?
I love it.
Yeah, learning.
Thank you. One more?
Just like kind of on what William was saying, on the earlier conversation, we were like kind of thinking about how this sort of like the mega system is almost like all the tools that we have in our society is working within that sort of a structure and to the benefit of that mega system. Even if we look at our news, you know, our news, or I look at this, you know, like every time my daughter wants to watch like a new series or episode, like it's this sort of that you have this sort of narrative. Like with the news, you have all the negative, you know, forces. You hear about everything negative happening in the world, but all the positive things that is happening, that it could actually help us understand each other or learn from that sort of processes. We don't hear them. Like we have to excavate them and look for them and find them like in different like parts of the, you know, world, rather than something that we could like constantly hear and adhere or like learn from. The same with sort of like thinking about the structure of media. Like every single episodes that like we watch, try to find something for my daughter to kind of watch, is that you hear like through this whole episode for like children, you hear all the negative things, all the negative interactions, all the bad things that you don't want to teach your child. And then at the end of it, they have this like turning point. Oh, by the way, we learned from this and we shouldn't do that. So like that 15 minutes, you're just reinforcing the negative things. And then at the end, there's like this like turning point of telling you, oh no, we should do otherwise. But your brain, you know, captures that 15 minutes, not that 2 seconds of the last minute. So like kind of thinking about that like how that sort of alternative ways that we are thinking about could be a way of, again, coming back to what you were saying, the systems that they already exist or the things that we could learn from, but be able to somehow amplify them, even though that the system is a structure for us not to do so. Does it make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
Last call?
Yeah, I was at a great weekend event in Wales called the Do Lectures in Wales. It's sort of like TED Talks only. It's a British version of it. And one of the key things was that we did things, you know, and you're in this remote, beautiful location on this 16th century stone barn farm. And yet there was a master baker there, and he was teaching us how to make sourdough bread over the fire. And we were sharing in that experience, which naturally in a campfire experience led to singing. Of course, you're in Wales, lots of drinking. And then, you know, you're in the dark and people finding their own way back to these yurts, and these tents with their sleeping bags, and you create your own fire in the dark in different ways. You know, whether you put a little candle in a glass or a lantern or whatever. And it creates this sense of, you know, what did we do in the bygone days? We gathered, and then there was storytelling. But the shared experience of creating food was really, it's not just, oh, we were served wonderful food, which of course we were, but the communal arts just kept folding, you know, and unfolding, you know, as we went along.
Thank you.
Just like piggyback onto that, because in our group, Sam was talking about, well, could we do skill shares, and are there particular techniques that we've been developing here that could be condensed into a sort of short, ongoing workshop format where people who are coming in and out of this space in June could learn how to, you know, shoot a 3-minute 360, you know, video or whatever the case may be, and building on the food thing, because when Emily from Ella VR was here back at the beginning of the ODL, like, you know, several years ago, after she came and talked about experiments in spherical video, we had a dumpling making party back at the house I was staying in, and she documented that with it and made a short 3-minute spherical video, like with the camera here and all of us learning how to roll dumplings from my other housemate. So if there's food component in this June event, maybe it could also be documented and people could be learning some of our production techniques as well.
Absolutely. And of course there has to be food somewhere. So in June, we're going to set aside 4 days and do this Festival of Public Making. We'd love it if any of you are interested to stay in touch with us and potentially do stuff with us in that festival. And we're still working on the work to get it set up, but consider yourselves invited.